Well, hello again. Here I am, scanning, and more scanning. Some time ago I discovered a collection of old film. Two of these were of a gauge I didn't even know existed at the time. 28mm film was very scarce and hard to find, as I found out. And interestingly enough, the films that I discovered are of two different manufacturers that each had their own 28mm format. A little bit more about that later, though. I was only able to process the shorter of these two films. It was done by manually scanning every frame of the film on my trusty Epson Perfection V700 flatbed scanner. That's a mouthful. And producing it manually using the Adobe Photoshop and Premiere editing software. The other film is far too long for this process, but I will share a few scans that I took of that film also. The film that I was able to produce is comprised of 3 individual scenes and was shot sometime prior to 1920, I believe, but there is no date code on that film, so I cannot be for sure. The other is a very rare film that has been identified by date code as 1923, produced by the Lincoln Parker Company, and with the subject being Plymouth, Boston, Massachusetts. So today, the video is primarily about 28mm films. This is 28mm film, and by the way, it's the same one that I was able to scan and produce a video from that you'll see in a little while here. Okay, let's hold up for a moment. I'm going to explain to you what you are seeing right now, and that is video of my office, and that's a whole lot more interesting than dead space or my face, as I don't have video or photographs of some of the things I'm talking about. So rather than just show you a blank background or my ugly mug, take a look at my office. It's pretty interesting. In 1912, the Pathé Film Company, a little history on 28mm, it's kind of important. The Pathé Film Company in France introduced to the amateur market 28mm. The film size itself is not really that important, but what is important is that they utilize a diacetate film stock rather than the more dangerous and extremely flammable nitrate film stock commonly used for 35mm. I'll give you a demonstration on how flammable that stuff is in just a bit. I've put it in another video not long ago, but it bears looking at again. Many of us are familiar with the 8 and 16mm film our families used before the advent of magnetic tape cameras and players such as VHS. But in the last 100 years, many film gauges were experimented with. There was the strange 9.5mm that only had one perforation centered between each frame. And by the way, this was also a Pathé film gauge. Others were 13mm, 15, 17.5, 20, 22. Oh, by the way, that 22, that was another strange one. That had 3 rows of images that were separated by 2 rows of perforations. There was a 24mm gauge, and that had no perforations. And then there's 35 and 70mm film stock. Of those, only 5 gauges survived history with any proliferation whatsoever. And those were 8mm and the Super 8 variation, 16mm, 28, and then 35 and 70mm film stocks that were primarily used in movie theaters. You know, I was just thinking that some of you might not understand what I'm referring to when speaking of perforations, but those are the little holes on the edge of the film and what the camera and projectors use to grab and run the film through their respective machines. Some folks, and even myself sometimes, refer to them as sprocket holes. And here's a small example of the film gauges I'm most familiar with. It'll give you some perspective on size. The top row here is Super 8mm. This is a later variation on standard 8mm, but had some distinct improvements over its predecessor that was just below on the table. The films are both the same width, but that's where the similarity ends. The most obvious difference are the perforations or sprocket holes. The Super 8mm film has far smaller holes than the 8mm, which allows for a wider and taller image per frame. Super 8mm also puts a perforation at the middle of each frame versus at the junction of each frame, as in the standard 8mm. All of this allows for a frame size that's 50% larger on the Super 8 and making it a much sharper image. Next is a 16mm film that was available in silent or sound versions, and by the way, the 8 and Super 8mm both had versions of sound film available for those also. Although on the regular 8, it was a magnetic strip that was added later after processing. This next film is from Pathé film stock. This 28mm film has one perforation per frame on one edge of the film and 3 on the other. And that large image size of 19 by 14 millimeters allows for a great projected picture to be of a very high quality. In the second version, just below it, is a variation on the Pathé 28mm that was developed in 1918 for the amateur film market by inventor Alexander Victor in America. His idea was to create a standard gauge for non-theatrical films that was used by amateurs in schools, churches, and fraternal organizations. The fact that it was made using the much safer diacetate film stock made it perfect for the application. It was the same as Pathé's 1912 film gauge, with one exception. It had 3 perforations on each side, with frame dimensions being the same. This last little piece of film here is a 35mm sound film. That's an optical sound strip, and I'll show you a close-up of that. I've turned it red so it's easy to see, but the sound comes in 2 varieties. One is magnetic sound and one is optical sound, and you can tell the difference between the two. Magnetic sound will be just a brown strip running down the side of the film, in the same position here. That's on the optical sound, but 35mm sound. I mentioned earlier that I would demonstrate the flammability of nitrate film. Remember that one of the most appealing aspects of the 28mm film was its composition being the less dangerous acetate-based versus nitrate-based film used in those larger film formats. It bears noting that neither version of 8mm or 16mm film was ever manufactured using a nitrate base. And I only say that because I've heard people in the past talking about that, concerned that their film might burn up in their garage or attic or something. It'll go bad, but it's not going to blow up on them. An example of just how important it was that the nitrate film was replaced in later years by a celluloid acetate film, safety film, is those devastating, horrific nitrate film fires in 1978. Both the National Archives and the George Eastman House went up in flames from spontaneous combustion caused by nitrate film. And it was really horrible because in those fires at the National Archives, over 12 million feet of newsreel footage was destroyed, and at the Eastman House, the negatives for over 300 films were destroyed. And the firemen couldn't put the films out. I mean, nitrate film burns in underwater. I can only imagine what might be permanently lost to history, and I can only hope that all of it had been transferred to safety film by that time. The film that I used in this demonstration was dated about 1930 or so, and is part of a very long scene where nothing was really important in the film. And actually, this film was shot in Sacramento on 35mm nitrate film at a Philco store. So it's I don't know if it was an in-house film that was shot, or if it was for advertising, or for what purpose it was. But it would have been great film, but you'll see that there was not much left of it. According to the date code in this film, it was manufactured in 1923. Notice also that there are 3 perforations per frame on this film. This is a travelogue of sorts that takes place in Plymouth and Boston, Massachusetts. It was produced by the Lincoln and Parker Company that was established in Worcester, Massachusetts, the same company that acquired the assets and films of a failed production company owned by Thomas Edison. After the sale, he worked for Lincoln and Parker as a consulting editor. I haven't attempted to manually digitize the film as it's far too long and I don't own the proper equipment at the moment. You can read the Lincoln and Parker logo on the left in this frame. The film has no head and no tail for identification of the title, but the subject is fairly easily identified. This is a very early film beginning at Plymouth Rock with a nice view of the original canopy structure that housed, according to this film, the cornerstone of a nation, and I believe rightly so. This is a great view of the rock and the fish market in the distance when you zoom in. Now keep in mind that this film has been date coded as being 1923, but the structure over Plymouth Rock here was removed in 1920, making at least some of the scenes contained in the film a bit earlier. I've never been to Plymouth, but after viewing what I can of this film, I would love to see that part of American history. Here are 3 views in several different lengths of film I scanned. From Burial Hill, facing the village, and the first church in Plymouth, I believe it's called the Church of the Pilgrimage, sitting in the background. And then the old shore road leading from Plymouth to Duxbury. And it's a nice little view of that part of the town. As we zoom in here, and you'll see down at the end of the street down there is Plymouth Rock again, the structure containing Plymouth Rock. As I said, I've never been here, so this is all unfamiliar ground to me. I was really surprised when I zoomed in and found the rock down there. And that must be the fish market across the way on the right-hand side. And then Pilgrim Hall, containing the sword of Damascus and other relics. And that's Pilgrim Hall hasn't changed, but the buildings on either side have. Tremont Church in the background, but when you zoom in, the cars, maybe somebody can, I'm horrible at identifying years, automobiles, but the Coca-Cola sign that appears in this scene is pretty interesting there. It's pretty old. And Tremont Church. Yeah, if somebody can identify the year of this or this particular scene, I would really appreciate it. Those cars, as I said, I couldn't do it. And of course, we have the Washington Elm, and that has really changed. Of course, the elm tree, and again, it helps date the film because the elm tree actually fell over in 1923. So this film is 1923 or earlier, and I'd say quite a bit earlier, probably 3 or 4 years maybe. That's the view, and I can't remember, it's just about 1900, I believe, or just before. That's the view from my film. That's a view when it fell down. And that's taken in the last few years, prior to them covering it up with asphalt. Now it's just an asphalt plug in the road, and across the street in the park there is where the new Washington Elm is planted. But it's amazing how history gets moved around this way. I have mentioned it already, but it bears noting once again that this film format is an example of the film manufactured by Pathé. This is 28mm and has one perforation per frame on one edge of the film and 3 on the other. You can see how nice the larger and wider frame would make for superior projecting over 16mm and almost equal to that of 35 professional film used by movie studios. Here I'm using Adobe Photoshop to separate the frames into individual images so that they can be imported into Adobe Premiere to be reassembled as a movie. To accomplish this, I had to scan 333 individual 12-frame image slices and then created 3,996 unique single-frame images in Photoshop. That's roughly 36 solid hours of work to create a video that has a runtime of about 3 minutes and 20 seconds. I think it was worth it, though. What we're seeing here is a parade for firemen. I believe this film was shot possibly in either Pennsylvania or New York. In the last 20 years, I've seen thousands of photos, negatives, and films produced from all over the world, and after a while you just get a feel for the particulars about an unknown image or film as we have here. We can say almost certainly that it was produced in the United States in around 1920, give or take a couple of years. This first scene gives us some clues. For instance, the houses and vehicles, as well as the dress of those bystanders and that of the firemen in the parade, all bear characteristics common in the United States, but something about the house construction and uniforms looks Eastern to me. With luck, one of you will be able to add more information to this. It appears that most of these are horse-drawn pumper and ladder wagons with just a couple of motorized units. An interesting note is that the New York Fire Department ushered out the last horse-drawn pump wagon in 1922. And I'm sure that these are not just parade horses and prop vehicles. These are the real thing. And here we catch the students at this school exiting after a hard day at the books as a number of them congregate on the sidewalk in front of the building. You can see that the horse and wagon are still common here. If age can be gauged by how tall a person is from a distance, these children range from fairly young to mid-teens or so. I'm suspecting that probably this is school from 1st through 8th grade, probably. I don't see anybody there that looks like I don't think they're too much older than that. It really does look like a grade school. They sure are dressed nice for grade schoolers. All the girls in dresses and the young men with a lot of them with vests on and so forth. It's a little breezy, but it's still summer months. And if somebody can identify that truck, the year or the model, that would be really interesting. Again, as I watch this, I get a feeling of eastern states, and this next clip really drives that home when I look at this bridge or aqueduct. To the right looks like a small town or a factory. As the film pans left, we see hundreds of trucks in a field and then children playing baseball. I'm sorry for the way this jumps around, but it was the best that I could do with the equipment that I have at the moment. I hope you enjoyed this, and maybe I was able to show you something new you hadn't seen before. I want to thank you for watching, and please, if you believe in what I'm doing here, preserving and sharing these old films, consider making a contribution. I can be reached through my website at Office of Image Archaeology. By the way, if you like old photographs, you'll love this website. Enjoy.